Episode 68, April 22nd to the 28th, 1915. Canadian Courage and Self-Sacrifice at the Second Ypres Battle by Lord Beaverbrook. Read by Clark Puckett. Lord Beaverbrook, who, as Sir Max Aitken, was Canadian eyewitness, had unexampled opportunities for watching the deeds of gallantry of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He here describes the heroic actions during the Second Battle of Ypres, which in part or whole fell under his own observation. In the words of his friend Bonar Law, Prime Minister in 1922, his account is a model of lucid, picturesque, and sympathetic narrative. Here he also describes the effects of the first use of poison gas by the Germans on the Ypres front. My story of the Second Battle of Ypres is the story of how the Canadian Division, enormously outnumbered, for they had in front of them at least 4 divisions, supported by immensely heavy artillery, with a gap still existing though reduced in their lines, and with dispositions made hurriedly under the stimulus of critical danger, fought through the day and through the night, and then through another day and night, fought under their officers until, as happened to so many, these perished gloriously, and then fought from the impulsion of sheer valor because they came from fighting stock. The enemy, of course, was aware, whether fully or not, may be perhaps doubted, of the advantage his breach in the line had given him, and immediately began to push a formidable series of attacks on the whole of the newly formed Canadian salient. If it is possible to distinguish, when the attack was everywhere so fierce, it developed with particular intensity at this moment on the apex of the newly formed line running in the direction of Saint-Julien. 4 British guns were taken in a wood comparatively early in the evening of April 22nd. The general officer commanding the Canadian Division had no intention of allowing the enemy to retain possession of either the wood or the guns without a desperate struggle, and he had ordered a counterattack towards the wood to be made by the 3rd Infantry Brigade under General Turner. This brigade was then reinforced by the 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Watson and the 3rd Toronto Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Rennie, both of the 1st Brigade. The 7th Battalion, British Columbia Regiment, from the 2nd Brigade had by this time occupied entrenchments in support of the 3rd Brigade. The 10th Battalion of the 2nd Brigade, intercepted on its way up as a working party, was also placed in support of the 3rd Brigade. The assault upon the wood was launched shortly after midnight of April 22nd to 23rd by the 10th Battalion and 16th Canadian Scottish Battalion, respectively commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Boyle and Lieutenant Colonel R.G.E. Leckie. The advance was made under the heaviest machine gun and rifle fire. The wood was reached, and after a desperate struggle by the light of the misty moon, they took the position at the point of the bayonet. An officer who took part in the attack described to me how the men about him fell under the fire of machine guns which, in his phrase, played upon them, quote, like a watering pot, unquote. He added quite simply, quote, I wrote my own life off, unquote, but the line never wavered. When one man fell, another took his place, and, with a final shout, the survivors of the 2 battalions flung themselves into the wood. The German garrison was completely demoralized, and the impetuous advance of the Canadians did not cease until they reached the far side of the wood and entrenched themselves there in the position so dearly gained. They had, however, the disappointment of finding that the guns had been destroyed by the enemy, and later in the same night a most formidable concentration of artillery fire, sweeping the wood as a tropical storm sweeps the leaves from the trees of a forest, made it impossible for them to hold the position for which they had sacrificed so much. Within a few hours of this attack, the 10th Canadian Battalion was again ordered to advance by Lieutenant Colonel Boyle, late a rancher in the neighborhood of Calgary. The assault was made upon a German trench, which was being hastily constructed within 200 yards of the battalion's right front. Machine gun and rifle fire opened up upon the battalion at the moment the charge began, and Colonel Boyle fell almost instantly with his left thigh pierced in 5 pieces. Major McLaren, his second in command, was also wounded at this time. Battalion stretcher bearers dressed the colonel's wounds and carried him back to the battalion first aid station. From there, he was moved to Vladimir Field Hospital, and from there to Poppering. He was unconscious when he reached the hospital and died shortly thereafterwards without regaining consciousness. Major McLaren, already wounded, was killed by a shell while on his way to the hospital. The command of the 10th Battalion passed on to Major D.M. Ormond, who was wounded. Major Guthrie, a lawyer from Fredericton, New Brunswick, a member of the local parliament and a very resolute soldier, then took command of the battalion. The fighting continued without intermission all through the night of April 22nd to 23rd, and to those who observed the indications that the attack was being pushed with ever-growing strength, it hardly seemed possible that the Canadians, fighting in positions so difficult to defend and so little the subject of deliberate choice, could maintain their resistance for any long period. Reinforcements of the British troops, commanded by Colonel Gettys of the Buffs, began to arrive in the Gap early on Friday morning. These reinforcements, consisting of 3.5 battalions of the 28th Division, drawn from the Buffs, King's Own Royal, Leinsters, Middlesex, and York and Lancasters, and other units which joined them from time to time, became known as Gettys Detachment, the Grenadier Company of a battalion of the Northumberland Fusiliers, numbering 2 officers and 120 men, who were on their way to rejoin their division after 8 days of trench fighting at Hill 60, encountered Colonel Gettys' force and joined it. Colonel Gettys was killed on the morning of April 28th in tragic circumstances. He had done magnificent work with his composite force, and after 5 days' terrific fighting, received orders to retire. He was just leaving his dugout after handing over his command when a shell ended his career. At 6 a.m. on Friday, the 2nd Canadian Brigade was still intact, but the 3rd Canadian Brigade on the left was bent back upon Saint-Julien. It became apparent that the left was becoming more and more involved, and a powerful German attempt to outflank it developed rapidly. The consequences, if it had been broken or outflanked, need not be insisted upon. They would not have been merely local. It was therefore decided, formidable as the attempt undoubtedly was, to try to give relief by a counterattack upon the first line of German trenches, now far, far advanced from those originally occupied by the French. The attack was carried out at 6:30 a.m. by the 1st Ontario Battalion and the 4th Battalion of the 1st Brigade under Brigadier General Mercer, acting with Gettys Detachment. The 4th Battalion was in advance and the 1st in support under the covering fire of the 1st Canadian Artillery Brigade. It is safe to say that the youngest private in the ranks, as he set his teeth for the advance, knew the task in front of him, and the youngest subaltern knew all that rested on its success. It did not seem that any human being could live in the shower of shot and shell which began to play upon the advancing troops. They suffered terrible casualties. For a short time every other man seemed to fall, but the attack was pressed ever closer and closer. The 4th Canadian Battalion at one moment came under a particular withering fire. For a moment, not more, it wavered. Its most gallant commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Birchall, carrying, after an old-fashioned, a light cane, coolly and cheerfully rallied his men, and at the very moment when his example had infected them, fell dead at the head of his battalion. With a hoarse cry of anger they sprang forward, for indeed they loved him, as if to avenge his death. The astonishing attack which followed pushed home in the face of direct frontal fire made in broad daylight by battalions whose names should live forever in the memories of soldiers, was carried to the first line of the German trenches. After a hand-to-hand struggle, the last German who resisted was bayoneted, and the trench was won. The measure of our success may be taken when it is pointed out that this trench represented, in the German advance, the apex in the breach which the enemy had made in the original line of the Allies, and it was 2.5 miles south of that line. This charge, made by men who looked death indifferently in the face, for no man who took part in it could think he was likely to live, saved, and that was much the Canadian left. But it did more. Up to the point where the assailants conquered or died, it secured and maintained during the most critical moment of all the integrity of the Allied line, for the trench was not only taken, it was held thereafter against all comers, and in the teeth of every conceivable projectile, until the night of April 25th, Sunday, when all that remained of the war-broken but victorious battalions was relieved by fresh troops. It is necessary now to return to the fortunes of the 3rd Brigade, commanded by General Turner, which, at 5 o'clock on Thursday, was holding the Canadian left, and after their first attack, assumed the defense of the new Canadian salient. At the same time, sprang all the men it could to form an extemporized line between the wood and Saint-Julien. The brigade was also, at the first moment of the German offensive, made the object of an attack by a discharge of poisonous gas. The discharge was followed by 2 enemy assaults. Although the fumes were extremely poisonous, they were not, perhaps, having regard to the wind, so disabling as on the French lines, which ran almost east to west, and the brigade, though affected by the fumes, stoutly beat back the 2 German assaults. Encouraged by this success, it rose to the supreme effort by the assault on the wood, which has already been described. At 4 a.m. on the morning of Friday the 23rd, a fresh emission of gas was made both on the 2nd Brigade, which held the line running northeast, and on the 3rd Brigade, which, as had been fully explained, had continued the line up to the pivotal point as divined above, and had there spread down in a southeasterly direction. It is perhaps worth mentioning that 2 privates of the 48th Highlanders who found their way into the trenches perished in the fumes, and it was noticed that their faces became blue immediately after dissolution. The Royal Highlanders of Montreal, 13th Battalion, and the 48th Highlanders, 15th Battalion, were more especially affected by the discharge. The Royal Highlanders, though considerably shaken, remained immovable on their ground. The 48th Highlanders, who no doubt received a more poisonous discharge, were for the moment dismayed, and indeed their trench, according to the testimony of very hardened soldiers, became intolerable. The battalion retired from the trench, but for a very short distance and for a very short time. In a few moments, they were again their own men. They advanced on and reoccupied the trenches which they had momentarily abandoned. In the course of the same night, the 3rd Brigade, which had already displayed a resource, a gallantry, and a tenacity for which no eulogy could be excessive, was exposed, and with it the whole Allied cause, to a peril still more formidable. Several German divisions were attempting to crush or drive back this devoted brigade, and in any event to use their enormous numerical superiority to sweep around and overwhelm its left wing. At some point in the line which cannot be precisely determined, the last attempt partially succeeded, and, in the course of this critical struggle, German troops in considerable, though not in overwhelming numbers, swung past the unsupported left of the brigade, and in slipping in between the wood and Saint-Julien, added to the torturing anxieties of the long-drawn struggle by the appearance, and indeed, for the moment, the reality of isolation from the brigade base. In the exertions made by the 3rd Brigade during this supreme crisis, it is almost impossible to single out one battalion without injustice to others. But though the efforts of the Royal Highlanders of Montreal 13th Battalion were only equal to those of the other battalions who did such heroic service, it so happened by chance that the fate of some of its officers attracted special attention. Major Norsworthy was in the reserve trenches half a mile in the rear of the firing line when he was killed in his attempt to reach Major McQuaig with reinforcements, and Captain Guy Drummond fell in attempting to rally French troops. This was on the afternoon of the 22nd, and the whole responsibility for coping with the crisis then fell upon the shoulders of Major McQuain until he was relieved early on the morning of the 23rd. All through the afternoon and evening of the 22nd, and all through the night which followed, McQuaig had to meet and grapple with difficulties which might have borne down a far more experienced officer. His communications had been cut by shell fire, and he was, therefore, left to decide for himself whether he should retire or whether he should hold on. He decided to hold on, although he knew that he was without artillery support and could not hope for any until at the earliest the morning of the 23rd. The decision was a very bold one. By all the rules of war, McQuaig was a beaten man. But the very fact that he remained appears to have deceived the Germans. They might have overwhelmed him, but they feared the supports, which did not in reality exist. It was not in the enemy's psychology to understand that the sheer and unaided valor of McQuaig and his little force would hold the position. But with a small and dwindling force he did hold it, until daylight revealed to the enemy the naked deception of the defense.